Okay, this typically happens when I talk, before we start recording.
Go
Anyway,
ahead.
so no,
You
we
started
just
with
keep
the
going. This is fine.
no, no,
You
no.
you you were just saying about how bad James Bond is doing as a spy. And the point you mentioned, what I think which is valid, like if you use your firearm in that capacity, you basically are pulled out. In
Yes.
Casino Royale, the first one with Daniel Craig, they actually kind of reference that where he ends up shooting this guy and creating this explosion. He's all over the newspapers, and M is like, you completely messed up. You
Yes.
basically expose yourself to the entire world,
Yeah.
and I think that's like a huge part of what this fantasy about spy work is about. Is that it's all James Bond stuff, and most of it, like you said, is like, no, you've got two jobs. You've got the job that is basically your cover, and then you've got the actual job that you're supposed to be doing, recruiting people.
And to do it well, you need to be as low profile as possible, drawing the least
Yeah,
amount of attention to you and meeting as many people as you can in order to assess them for recruitment targets. And things like guns or things like getting your name in the paper or stuff like that, that all is counterintuitive to keeping that low profile. And so if you are in that James Bond scenario where you use your gun, you're going to go home. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. They're going to pull you out and send you home. Not necessarily because you did anything wrong, but because your ability to then operate in that environment is just gone.
yeah,
But it also is somewhat of a failure of tradecraft. If you got yourself into a situation and that firearm, which was supposed to be the choice of last resort, ends up being what you have to use. What did you miss along the way
yeah.
in your awareness? Where did you not do a good surveillance detection run? Did you, I mean, yes, things happen, but most of the time there's a reason things happen.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, in the environments that you're working in, the the country that you're working in, they do have counter espionage, active, trying to prevent you from doing your job. So it's not that you could just do your thing and nobody's going to even try to notice that something's going on. Um, is that something that you can talk about a little bit? Just psychological aspect of that. Like you are
Sure.
operating in this foreign country, you know what you're doing there, but you also know that you really don't want to get caught in some of those countries because that let's put it mildly, that the prison system there might be very different from the
Well,
one in the US.
the easy thing for me was that I was always under official cover. So
Yeah.
what that meant was that even if I got arrested, most likely the worst that would happen would be I'd spend a night in jail and I would get roughed up a little bit, in the process. And we've seen that happen kind of most regularly in Moscow,
Yeah.
where they've arrested CIA officers, they've held them for questioning, they've interrogated them overnight, but they're always released the next day. And then they're usually given 3 or 4 days to get out of the country and get kicked out and sent home. And but the reason we operate so seriously, even in those when that risk is relatively mild to somebody like myself, is because it's a far more dangerous risk to the sources that we manage and the
Mm.
people that we've pledged to protect. These folks who have volunteered to work with us or have agreed to work with us, they're putting their lives in my hands. And so I have to do everything possible I can to try and protect them. And so keeping the nature of what I do is secret is key to that process of keeping them safe. And so that's one of the reasons we take it so seriously. But it is wearing on you, right? It's always hard when you have to spend a significant amount of time living a double life.
Yeah.
And so that's something everybody has to come to grips with and manage their own stress levels and manage their own emotional health in that process.
And when you're posted abroad, is that for like a fixed period of time? Like you have in the military, you're like you go on a tour and that's like X amount of months predetermined, then you can be prolonged, obviously. But how does that work? Like I'm gonna that date I'm in, that day my date I'll be out, no matter what.
Well, the my favorite answer to almost any question about the intelligence world is always it depends, right? There's so many situationally dependent issues that come up, but generally speaking, you always know what your time frame in that assignment is going to be. You may not know the exact dates, but you're going to always know, hey, this is a 1 year wartime tour, or this is a 3 year, tour, or this is a 2 year headquarters assignment. So you always know roughly what those are. The dates will never be exactly 2 years. It might end up being 2 years and 2 weeks, or whatever. But yeah, you pretty much your end time as you're starting in any of those given roles.
Right. When you look at obviously the training that you do before you can do that kind of job, obviously, again, we're not going to get into the details of that, but there is a significant amount of training. And then, as with anything, there's always the learning as you go, as you develop experience. Is there something you could talk about that? Maybe a story or an anecdote or something that you're like, okay, that was not covered in training, but all of a sudden you're like, okay, deal with this.
Right. Yeah, it was interesting because I actually wrote about one of these, and in our training, we were taught how to spot, assess, develop, and recruit assets, and sometimes how to terminate them as well. And by terminate, we don't mean terminate with extreme prejudice, like the movies would say, but basically to fire them, right? To say our time has ended and you go your way, we go ours. But what they didn't teach you is all the different variables that come to bear in that process. And in my first tour, I had to terminate an asset who had been an incredibly loyal asset to us for many, many years. I learned as much about being an officer from him as I did from my instructors. This guy had been meeting with us for so long and had known so many of our officers that he was a great on-the-job instructor for me as how to do this job. And that included ultimately in how to fire him, and not in that case honor the agreement that we had made with him about how much we would pay him as a retirement kind of thing. And because it was a time of budget cuts, and so nobody told me I was going to have to renegotiate a previously agreed to amount with an asset who literally had put his life on the line, right? The work he was doing, had he been caught by the folks that he worked for, he would have been killed. And yet 20 years later, we were kind of nickel and diming him over what we had agreed to pay him. And so that was an interesting learning experience that took a little bit of the shine off of kind of who we were and what we did, but also taught me a lot about people. And he was incredibly gracious. He totally accepted the new deal and went away understanding and happy. But he taught me a lot in that process.
Yeah, and is that something that you then immediately have to follow up with somebody else? Like, okay, you're done with this person, he's terminated, and you just instantly switch to the next one, and you have to keep this in the back of your mind. And that, well, I just had to basically blow up this deal that this guy was looking forward to, and then I'm going to have to present, a very sincere effort for the next person. It's like, okay, you can totally trust me.
It's a challenge, right?
Yeah.
I mean, a great example is the way America pulled out of Afghanistan, and the folks that we left behind in Afghanistan. 100% will affect our ability to recruit other sources in other parts of the world, because they will look at that and go, you guys didn't honor the promises that you made. And so, there's a significant sales component to the job. And, at the end of the day, each officer has to come to grips with their ability to work through this. But you are making the best deal you can at the time, right? Nobody has perfect foresight.
Yeah. It's funny. I just today, I finished reading the Afghanistan papers, the book. Really found it very interesting. Last few chapters, not so much, because we've got a tremendous amount of detail on, the Bush years, the Obama years, and so on. And then like Trump and Biden, very quickly, just, I don't know. I get to the point where I suspect there was an agenda there from the author, but because that was basically not covered at all, in my opinion. Just how the drawdown happened, and then just leaving Afghanistan the way that the US did. I think there's a lot to to analyze there and
I think
talk
there's, but I
about.
also think it's difficult to analyze it so soon in time.
Yeah, yeah,
I haven't read it, and so I don't know. Probably the author had a bit of an agenda because most do. That's why they're writing it. But anytime folks rush to get a book out so quickly in
yeah.
response to something so significant, I always worry a little bit about the depth of analysis that they'll get into, and then add into it how much of it's still classified, that sort of stuff muddies the waters in really being able to understand well what really happened in that event and how we got there.
Well, from my understanding, he did a lot of FOIA requests, and then also used basically lessons learned interviews with military folks and so on who were on the ground, because it took 20 years from beginning to end the U.S. presence there. So there was a fair amount of interviews that were done. Yep. And I think that's why, like you said, this is very recent. It's only been 2 years, I think yesterday or something. And the older generation of military men who were there, obviously, they were there for X amount of years and then moved on to something else. Those interviews, I guess they were available. So maybe that's why he covered that so much in depth. Whereas what happened 2 years ago, maybe not so much information. And we've got the president on whose watch that happened. He's still in power. So it is a New York Times journalist after all. So
well, I think the date is actually coming up, right? I think it's the end of August was the final days, like August 26th, maybe.
Yeah, I think maybe it started around this week, and then the whole thing kind of escalated. For me, it was mostly, I was listening to guys like Tim Kennedy, who apparently went there afterwards and like to try to get people out. And from people that I know, other people as well in organizations were just basically funding everything themselves, getting assets out, getting people who, in the eyes of the Taliban, collaborated with the enemy, and literally people who were disappearing overnight, and then the wives raped in front of their father and children, husband and the children, and then eventually slaughtered and so on. But that was like, okay, that's standard operating procedure almost, which is a part of everything that I always find like this kind of gruesomeness. Nobody enjoys talking about it, but it is the reality on the ground of a lot of these conflicts. And in my opinion, it gets very often just glossed over in the mainstream news. It's like, okay, let's talk about the actual horrific consequences of the Taliban now in power, what that actually meant.
Right.
And I remember seeing an interview when it all happened, a little bit afterwards, with I forget who it was, a military commander talking to the press, American one, and he said basically, yes, well, we're working with the Taliban to basically try to get them to be more democratic. And I was like, you guys been there 20 years. There is no way that this is going to happen. Basically, they're like, okay, we're here now. We've got a bunch of equipment that we didn't expect to get, and we can do whatever we want. And we know now, 2 years later, that human rights is just deteriorated, and you don't want to be a woman there now. It's because your life drastically changed for the worse. Right. And then that rings true throughout the book. And there is a question here: is just a way that, as in all conflicts, governments lie to the public, lie to their own Congress sometimes, just to embellish what's going on. Yes, we're making progress. 10 years later, yes, we're making progress in Afghanistan. And then, well, actually, we don't know if we're going to be able to win this war. You being on the ground, how does that work for you if you're on a mission somewhere and then you read some of the work that you're doing, you read about that in newspapers, and you see how back home this is all portrayed, like the disconnect must be impressive sometimes.
Yeah, but I think you're able to stay focused on what are the requirements I'm collecting against, right? I can't control who's in office. I can't control how anybody in a political sense is going to spin what I'm collecting, right? And so, but I still have to go out and do the best job I can to collect information against the requirements that are provided for me, by my own government. And so if we as kind of those on the ground spend too much time trying to assess how the information we're collecting is going to be misused, then that takes politicization all the way through the organization, and that's not healthy. Look, I didn't, I voted a specific way through most presidential elections, but I worked for presidents who were both Democrats and Republicans. One of the great things I knew was that this too will pass. It didn't matter which side. There was always going to be a change that was coming, right? But the bad guys were generally always the same bad guys, right?
Yeah.
The requirements, the threats to our nation, they didn't shift or change that dramatically, and certainly not from administration to administration. And so, when you see, I don't know, the yellow cake information being misused in order to draw Iraq into, the global war on terror or whatever, that's never really even thought about at the collection level at the time information is being collected, right? You're just going out and you're getting these sources, you're finding out what information they have that responds to requirements and tasking, and you're doing the best job you can to report that information back to the policymakers so that they can make the best decisions that they can. And sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes they use it or misuse it to achieve another end. And I think, sure, that can be frustrating, but you still have to do the best job you can to collect that information.
Not that long ago, I heard somebody say that whenever you look at a large organization, whether it's a multinational company, whether it's an official agency like the CIA, FBI, and so on, is that it's always a collection of individuals. It's never just, it is a bureaucracy, it is a system, if you will, but it's also always comprised of human beings, which means that you've got everything from people who lean one way politically to all the way the opposite end of that scale. People who are very diligent, people who are just basically doing a 9 to 5 and so on. But you also get factions
Yes,
who are vying for power. And without going into too many details, was that your experience as well?
sure. Well, and then add into it hierarchy of types of roles, right? So definitely there was stratification within the organization based on the type of job you did. So if you were, I don't know, if you were collecting economic intelligence in Liechtenstein, right? You didn't rise very high up on the food chain relative to somebody who was, running a source in Al-Qaeda, at the time, we were trying to go find bin Laden. And so all of that plays into it. You definitely see political factions build, and I don't mean politics right or left. I mean politics fighting over budget dollars or fighting over power or fighting over other resources. Because people, at the end of the day, most people are focused on self-preservation, right? And wanting to improve their role, their lot in life. And very few people are genuinely focused on the team must succeed at all else, And so I think you see a lot of that play out on a day-to-day basis. We definitely saw that. And then add to that legitimate politics where, the president chooses who's going to be the director, and the director replaces most of his staff. So you have all of these people that are not career intelligence folks and who are going to be there for a time frame. And now they're trying to manage bureaucrats who've been there for 20 years. And so there's stonewalling, there's, all of that comes to bear, or I like that guy, therefore I'm going to do more. Some of that does happen for sure.
Yeah. If you look at from you first entered the CIA until today, like what would be, in your opinion, like the biggest changes that happened with the agency?
Oh, well, I've been out a while, so I don't fully know all of the changes that have happened. But the one most significant change I would say has been a shift towards risk aversion. To me, talking to my colleagues inside, looking at the things that we did when I was in versus the things that we know about now that are done sometimes, there's a significant risk aversion that I think hurts the organization. We used to be an agency that took a lot of risks, and that has changed over time. The coast bombing, I think, had a significant impact on that. The loss of so many CIA officers in one particular operation radically changed that. And in becoming more risk averse, we shifted more of the risk onto the folks that we're supposed to help protect, the assets and informants who we meet and recruit.
That makes sense. This is a while ago that I read about that, and basically the point about 9/11 was made that there was a shift in intelligence agencies, basically maybe around the world, from human intelligence more towards signals and interpreting them and so on, whether it's open source or other types of documents, and basically the digitalization of the intelligence business. And working human sources apparently was viewed maybe as a little bit antiquated and so on, because we've got all this data that we can use now, we've got the internet and so on. Do you think that's fair, or is that exaggerated?
Well, I think the assessment that there was a shift away from human to SIGINT is a fair assessment. I think the shift itself was a mistake.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, human will never go away. No matter how good the technology becomes to collect kind of on a arm's length basis, human will never go away, because only a human can tell another human what they plan to do.
Yeah.
Only a human can tell you what's in their brain. And until there's a time where you can mind read, right? If you are listening to a phone conversation between two individuals, you still don't know what they're thinking. You still don't know if what they're saying to one another is real. And, so there will never not be a need to recruit human sources as close to those decision points as possible in order to truly understand plans and intentions.
Do you think that there's a growing awareness of this fact in the intelligence community, or is it still like, nope, signals, that's all that counts?
Oh no,
because we've got more now.
Look, I was always on the human side. Most of my friends are on the human side, so I don't think that was ever not known. I think
maybe at the top level then.
Yeah, well, a shift in budget dollars. I think people wanting, again, looking at lower risk ways to collect, drives some of that. But I think at some level, they always knew it. I just don't know that they wanted to admit it. And by the way, I think you need both, right?
Yeah.
I really do think there's tremendous value in all of the ints, right? So, I teach at, the university level on intelligence. And one of the things I talk about is, look, human is valuable, but so is OSINT. In fact, something like 85 or 90% of the intelligence collected and used in the world is collected via OSINT. OSINT brings with it different problems, including data management, right? There's
so much of it.
Yeah. How do you manage it all? But also there's incredible importance in imagery intelligence. There's incredible importance in measures and signals intelligence, which is MESINT. It's different than signal intelligence, which is the collection of electronic communications. All of those have a role and a place because they're pieces of a puzzle.
Yeah.
Right. And the puzzle happens to be a 3D puzzle. It's never a 2D puzzle. And if you only focus on SIGINT or you only focus on human, all you can do is build a 2D puzzle. You can't build a 3D puzzle. And so you really need all of them to work in concert.
Yeah, I remember many, many years ago, I was working with a startup company that was in the internet. And I'm trying to think back, at least 15 years ago. And that back then they were actually working on software for intelligence agencies, figuring out like a snapshot of what is going on social media. And that was basically big data.
Yeah.
Just capturing all that data and then having the computer programs that could analyze that and just instantly give you a measuring of, okay, this is the mood of the public, or this is kind of the overall tension level, because we see X amount of tweets and social media posts where there's foul language being used, there's threatening word being used, and so on. So again, the digitalization of all that, it gives a lot of tools. And my experience is that if you give an organization a new shiny tool, they love to play with it. They just love to play with it. And I always
They come by
wonder.
that honestly. They come by that honestly, right?
Yeah.
Remember, particularly a bureaucratic organization like a government, they've always been told, we're going to give you this money, but if you don't spend it, we're not going to give it to you again. And so same thing goes with those toys. If you didn't use it, then why would we give you the next toy you ask for? You have to go use it. You got So it creates this non-virtuous cycle of self-justification rather than saying, no, that was a bad decision. Like there's nobody can ever say that was a bad decision, because if you do, then you won't get justified for the next, possibly good decision. And so everybody has to go spend it or use it. It's silly.
It's silly. We had the same thing here. I don't know if I'm not sure they still do, because the military budget over here has shrunk over time. But basically, what it used to be is that they would drive a truckload of military vehicles from one end of the country to the other end, going from one base to the other, to basically drive up all the fuel that they had, so that they could justify the budget for next year. Like, no, we need the fuel; it's all gone. and that tends to escalate within companies and organizations always, and that just
same thing with ammo.
Yeah.
Because none of us will turn down free ammo, so we're happy to go shoot it. Range day.
When you look at, you've got you spent 10 years in the agency, what was kind of the trigger for you to say, like, okay, I'm going to get out?
Really was family. What a couple of things happened. I did want to go back and go to graduate school, and that's something that I had always wanted to do, and my wife was encouraging me to do that as well. But I realized that I was getting promoted out of doing the fun stuff, and wasn't sure I wanted to just spend the rest of my career managing other people doing the fun stuff. And so that combination of things, along with a growing family, and it's a really hard life on families, right?
Yeah.
That working two jobs in essence does mean that you're out an awful lot of time. You travel a lot and are not able to communicate with your family while traveling. You hang out with a lot of not very nice people in not very nice places sometimes. And all of that just adds wear and tear on your family. And of course, you can't explain to your spouse, even if your spouse is an employee of the organization necessarily, they don't always know exactly what you're doing. And so that can breed distrust in a relationship as well. And so long story short, we decided that we had served our time and served it well and honorably, but it was time for us to go on and do other things and focus on what we wanted to do. And very few of the marriages that we knew, our friends that joined with us, very few of those marriages survived.
Yeah.
It's incredibly hard for families.
And obviously also same thing for the children. I mean, what do you tell your kids that mom and dad do? Well, can say what the real job is about, but then again, it has to be something that is plausible, that they can relate to, because otherwise they'll get curious if something's starts to not really add up anymore.
Actually that's a known thing, right? That's something that we will talk about, because at some point you have to tell your kids, because it becomes, the risk shifts from it's too risky to tell them because they're too young to it's too risky to not tell them because they'll figure it out and then they'll screw it up. And so everybody has to find their own way of bringing their kids into that circle of trust that says, hey, I trust you enough to tell you, while not undermining the fact that I didn't trust you enough for the last 12 years. And there's some pretty humorous stories that folks have shared over how well or poorly some of those conversations have taken place with their kids, in that kind of 12, 13, 14, maybe even 15-year-old timeframes.
I can imagine. I mean, I'm lucky now that my kids are all adults now, and my daughter graduated. She's about to start working in a few weeks, and my son is in third year. He's got 2 more years to go. So I'm way past all that kind of stuff. So that's good news.
Yeah.
But you kind of touched on the psychological aspect a little bit, and we talked about this before we started recording. But the painting that is behind you, and for the audience, it's a beautiful painting of basically, I wouldn't say the cliche, but the image you get in your head when there's a clandestine meeting of two spies, somewhere, and they're both wearing the overcoat and the hat, and they're dark figures, and one is going one way, one is going the opposite way. First of all, I'd like you to shout out the artist again, but also you mentioned that what is really particular about the painting is that it looks like there's stripes coming off the figure in the frontmost, and that symbolizes something specific. And I really like that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So
and how that was for you?
Yeah, so that the artist is a phenomenal artist who goes by the handle of Invader Girl on Instagram, and she's also on LinkedIn as well. And she does a whole bunch of really, really great pieces of art. And she and I started talking about this, and I said, "Look, one of the themes that carries through all of her work." She spends a lot of time focusing on special forces, first responders, soldiers. And so the theme that carries through it is these emotional and psychological cost that all of us bear to do any of this sort of kind of work. So what she captured in this painting is a brush pass or an exchange has just happened between an asset and an officer, and they're parting ways and going off and doing their thing. But those stripes that come out capture a little bit of the soul of the individuals involved, kind of leaving their bodies as they give up a little bit of themselves to go out and do this. And just simply speaking, when you are an intelligence officer, you lie every day. You lie all the time. And there's really good reasons for it. But I don't think it's possible to lie that much and not have it change you. Yeah. And I think it's an ongoing struggle and balance that all of us have to work through to find that point where we go, yeah, this is how I'm going to deal with it. This is how I'm going to try and repair that or make that whole. But it has to start first with the recognition of, yeah, that's not normal. That's not normal or healthy. And even though it's justified, right, that doesn't make it good for you. So if you have to do something that's not necessarily good for you on a repeated basis, then you better find ways to figure out how to offset that thing so that you can kind of get back whole again. And so her painting and all of her paintings do a really neat job of capturing some of what it takes out of you to do this. And we all sign up for it, right? Yeah. So there's no whining here.
Oh, yeah.
As much as there's truth and acknowledgement of it.
I think that's the key. I mean, it's like you said, you sign up for it, but obviously this is one of those things that you can only get the true nature of what that means afterwards. And like, it's often said the cost of it is something that I found with whether all sorts of violence professionals, military, intelligence work, and so on. If you're in the thick of things, I mean, there's always a cost to it. It's never free, quote unquote. There's always something that lingers at last, whether it's something that you have to do. I mean, I can imagine, like you said a little bit earlier, that you have this asset that you basically have to, fire and renege on a deal that you made in good faith. Or somebody else made for you in good faith, and that you're honoring, and then all of a sudden you're like, nope. So that kind of stuff, and obviously there's a lot, many situations that are much worse and more intense that you live through. But there's always I really like the expression you said, that you leave a little bit of your soul behind. Mm-hmm. And there's certain things that are it's really hard to come back from, and it marks you for life. I was fortunate enough to know a fair amount of people who were in the military and did intelligence work who talked about that and basically said that, okay, this is what happened, and I will have to live with this for the rest of my days. It was justified at the moment when it happened. The circumstances were what they were. These were the options. This is one we picked, or this was the only one that was left, and then we did that. but then years afterwards, and I think in particular when you retire, when you have plenty of time to think about all those things and second guess yourself, I can imagine that this is, and not talking about you specifically, but just in general, like this is something that many operatives have to work through afterwards. Is there from the agency something, to help you guys along afterwards? Is there follow-up after you retire?
There are some support mechanisms that are, and they're fairly unofficial to, that do that. But there are some support mechanisms there that folks can pursue for that. I mean, it's interesting. I think about like this whole, right now you see in a lot of social media, you see people talking about F around and find out, right? FAFO. But the thing that kind of, I get it, like I understand what they're saying, but I also understand as I listen to the glee that they say it with, there's something that said, okay, well, you've never been punched in the face before.
Yeah.
Because if you've really been face to face with some of this stuff, you're not so glib in how you throw those things around. And because it should never be easy to be that glib. Yes, you can know it takes 7 pounds of pressure to break an elbow or 14 pounds of pressure from the side to break a knee. But that intellectual knowledge is radically different than being willing to do it. And then forever, for the rest of your life, listening to the sound of that in your ear at odd moments and going, okay, yeah, so I did that thing and that thing had this consequence. And so it's really easy to talk about it, and it's much harder to do it, and even harder to live with having done it afterwards. And emotionally healthy people can go through that whole cycle and deal with it and work through it. I don't want anybody to do it easily, right? Because that's psychopathic. But and so finding ways to build those support systems in to support people that go, hey, that was actually hard to do. That's should be okay.
There's one more question before we move on that I like to ask, and obviously, different, U.S. government agencies have been getting a bad rep for the last few years, deserved or undeserved. That's all the different discussion. Yeah. But there's one point that I see brought up very, very rarely, and I forget who brought it up the first time that I heard about it a while ago. And he said that yes, maybe all that is true. So all the bad things the agencies do, or when they mess up and so on. But consider all the bad things that are prevented just by the mere fact that they exist and do the work they do. And I think that this is something that is very often just basically glossed over on, like, yeah, that's right. But here is a long list of all their mistakes again and what they did wrong. And I was like, yes, but I can never show you what you escaped, thanks to the work of a whole lot of anonymous people all over the world doing their job for your country, trying to keep you safe. And this is not me being rah-rah, let's go agencies. It's just, I find it difficult to talk to people nowadays in this polarized world because I live in the nuance. That's what interests me. You've got the Pareto principle, 80-20. I'm like, yes, the 80%, we very quickly get to that. Let's talk about the 20%. That's, in my opinion, where the true knowledge and skill lies in whatever it is.
Yes.
So is that something that you could, share your views on? Just this idea of like, okay, no matter how much you hate the CIA or the FBI, okay, this is what they protect you against. That if they're not there, there are US presidential candidates saying like, I'm going to abolish those agencies first day in office. I'm like, okay, well, what would be the potential consequences of that happening negatively? And this is not scaring people. This is just like, let's talk reality.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think about it this way. So there was a movie that came out several years ago called The Recruit, and Al Pacino was in it. Not necessarily the greatest movie, but he had a great line in that movie where he said, our failures are known, our successes are not. Yeah. Right. And that's because the failures tend to be so public and they tend to be so explosive. But the successes have two problems with them, right? If this on an intelligence collection basis, like our job is to collect information. So success means being able to continue to collect information. The FBI's job is conviction, right? At the end of the day, their job is to convict criminals and put them in jail. But if you stop something from happening, how do you prove you stopped this thing from happening? It just didn't happen, right? So the fact that, we've had 22 years without another 9/11 taking place in the United States, that's pretty successful, right? But I'm certain there are legitimate attacks that have been stopped in that process that nobody will ever know about, because of the nature of the need to protect those sources and protect the methods those things happen, and so on and so forth. And so and one of the problems that feeds this, I think, is the media's teaching the people that they have some incessant need to know every level of detail, rather than to go, hey, it's pretty good that nothing bad happened here, right? And, I think about it on a day-to-day basis of an individual who is reasonably situationally aware, is paying attention to their environment, and makes a decision to avoid a path or a behavior. And because they did that, nothing bad happened.
Yeah.
Does that reinforce or does it undermine their decision process the next time? Right. And they'll never know, because there's no hard data that says they would have failed if they'd gone down this path. They couldn't see the bad guy around the corner who was waiting there. They just read the environment and decided to make a left turn instead, and everything went fine. And so you have to live in this nuance, because that's the way the world actually functions, right? And we don't have perfect foresight, as we mentioned earlier. And so you have to base your decision matrix on this, and recognizing that, there's probably a lot of successes that we are unaware of. Now, that doesn't mean the agencies shouldn't also find ways to declassify things in order to be able to do that, right? The fact that there are still operations classified from, World War II or the early days of the CIA sometimes seems kind of absurd, right? And so the hyper classification of information inside government is part of the problem, and that in essence breeds distrust itself.
Yeah, and I really like the way that you just explained it about, you behave in a certain way, and this actually prevents bad things from happening, but you can never prove that. You can never show that. There's something, I'm totally blanking on the name. One of the space shuttles, how many years was that ago, exploded, and that basically, and that ended up being like, I think, an O-ring or something.
That's right.
That I think froze and then became brittle, and that was the cause. And then when all the investigations that happened to figure out what actually was the problem, was that what turned out is that bit by bit, every time that piece of equipment needed to be ordered or made, is that obviously they tried to get a better deal, make it cheaper and this and that. And then eventually the manufacturers would, the buffer that they had, the safety margin of this is when this little ring will fail, that became smaller and smaller, until there was this point, well, okay, now it's just a crapshoot. You never know what's going to happen, because the margin of error is so small that something goes wrong, and this equipment will fail with catastrophic results. And that there were warning signs within NASA about that, explaining like, look, guys, you got to be careful because we've got the margin. And the response was something along the lines of, well, nothing bad happened just yet, so why not? And that is something that I find, speaking from a self-defense angle, is that a lot of people over time develop this attitude. It's like, well, I never have any problems. Yes, because you were lucky. But you've been engaging in increasingly risky behavior. And the only thing that you have as an explanation for it is that, well, nothing happened. Yeah, that is not necessarily because of your behavior. That could just be blind luck, that you just never ran into the guy who's going to abuse whatever mistake that you're making and victimize you over it. And this is a while ago. I posted this on my Facebook page, and everybody got upset about me, where I'm going to my car, and there's this young girl who comes, who gets off the bus, and she's walking in front of me. She's walking the same direction, and I took pictures of her. She's unrecognizable. That is perfectly legal over here. As I'm walking to my car and I'm getting closer, she's got her headphones on. She's completely oblivious.
She's in white.
Yeah, I mean, completely. And my point was like, look, I'm not chastising her. I'm just saying like this. The only reason why you don't have an issue right now is that I live in a relatively safe town, and it's pretty low crime. There is crime, but it's pretty low. You try that in some of the other places in my country, and I mean, you're going to get victimized. Period.
Well, and also you're a good guy, because in essence, if you were the bad guy,
yeah, she'd be toast.
She'd be toast, right? Yeah. And it's interesting because people get upset about that largely because they don't want to have to confront their own poor behaviors or poor decisions either. They want to just, most people want to live in white, not realizing that the world's an orange world.
Yeah,
right.
That's true. We're talking about the color codes, Cooper color codes for the folks who don't know this. That's okay. Just trying to, sometimes talk for the audience. Just a quick hard turn. I mean, how did you get into, advising on movies and so on?
Sure.
Because that is something totally different.
It is and it is and it isn't. So I got involved in advising on films through some folks that reached out to me on social media and said, hey, we are helping folks that are making movies about special forces and intel themed stuff, make them better, right? We're helping give them advice, script consulting, and that sort of work so that those shows can be more realistic, more honoring of the people that do that work in the real world without sacrificing entertainment, right? So how do we help those Hollywood directors and those writers who've never done this stuff create, build a stronger bridge with those who have done it, while also not, costing them more money or making the movies more boring, right? Nobody wants to see a movie that's really about what it's like to be a case officer, because 98% of the time it's really boring because you're doing everything exactly the way you're supposed to do it and nobody knows what you're doing. That makes for a boring TV show. There are some that have done a good job of portraying pieces of it, and so that's what got me into working with folks and working on TV shows and movies to help that. And one of the really fun aspects for me has been to be able to work on several shows that have asked me to find them folks from the veteran community who can play tactical roles on film. And so I just get to stay in the background, and I have a network of 200-300 former service members who I can call upon that already know how to handle a weapon. They already know how to wear a uniform. They're going to show up on time. They're going to, do what they need to do. And then nobody's going to cherry pick in the background. Oh, that guy had his finger on the trigger, or that guy's mag change wasn't real, or those sorts of things. And they're all vets who are getting their first job in Hollywood, right? And that sort of thing. So the TV show SWAT on CBS has been one of the film shows that I've worked with, and they've been so great about wanting to hire veterans to work on the show for that. And it makes the show better, right? In ways that the audience will pay attention to, but it doesn't cost them anymore to do it. And so it's a really nice mix of work to be able to do that sort of stuff.
Are there any other Hollywood projects that you've worked on that you can talk about? Because I know sometimes you can't.
Yeah, so I've worked on a number of shows. Agent X was one. The Brave, which was a kind of a Task Force Orange type show, was one. I worked on a film called The Lost Leonardo about a Leonardo da Vinci painting. That was a documentary that came out last year, or maybe 3 years ago at Cannes. And then a couple of other, I'm doing some Cold War espionage themed documentaries now that I'm involved with. So still doing a little bit of it here and there. COVID changed a lot of it, which is good and bad. That means I don't have to travel to Hollywood nearly as much, but it also makes the work harder. We've got a Chris Pratt project that's kind of stuck in development. I don't know if that'll ever come out, but hopefully we'll get to finish making that film, along the way as well.
So speaking of Cold War and Hollywood, did you see The Americans?
I've seen pieces of it. Yes.
What do you think?
Well, again, the same comment that I made about Bond, I think off air, one of the comments was that the actions that Bond takes basically every 20 minutes would get any one officer pulled home from, a tour. Every episode of The Americans contains enough high threat and excitement for an entire officer's career, right?
Yeah.
And the bodies laying in the wake and the sexual escapades and all of that, are just so over the top relative to the way this world really works. But I will say this, the writing's great writing, right? It's an entertaining show, and pieces of the tradecraft that they show, represent that era in America's, intelligence community really, really well. The disguise technology used at those times, a lot of that is just really, really on point. And so it's a lot of fun, in that regard. And of course, it was inspired by, all of the Russian illegals who were wrapped up in Operation Ghost Stories. And it's written by a former CIA officer.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Obviously, as always, you have to take a lot of, like you said, take a lot of it with a grain of salt, because, 1 episode, 2 episodes, 3 episodes, all that kind of stuff, you would be pulled immediately, or you'd be basically captured as a spy, because that doesn't work. But they do kind of cover well, I think, some of the psychological aspects that you mentioned, living with Discover, and you don't have an official capacity, so you kind of screwed anything that happens, and it goes way over the top with some of the things. But this concept of, okay, what do we do with the children? When do we include them into that? That was covered quite well, in a sense. What I really liked is that obviously the daughter rebels. She's really upset, and basically threatens to blow everything up.
Yep.
But
and that's real. Like that really happens. And I think about there. So Tracy Foley and Donald Heathfeld were 2 of the Russian 10 that were arrested in 2010. And they were Russians who had illegally immigrated to Canada and then ultimately come from Canada to the United States. They were not really married. They were married, in the KGB, but not, and so presented themselves as married. They had 2 sons who were born in Canada while they were operating as illegals in Canada. Those sons had legitimate Canadian citizenship by birth and knew nothing initially of their parents' involvement in that. And, one son, after this all blew up, one son decided to ultimately stay in Moscow when they all got kicked out. But one son wanted to go back to Canada because his identity was Canadian. He didn't connect with his Russian identity at all in that regard. And so it's not just a thing that it happens to anybody that does this work.
Yeah. That's the kind of stuff that I find fascinating. Just trying to wrap your head around that when this gets dropped on you as maybe a teenager or something, like, hi there, your parents just got arrested, and why? Well, because they were spying for basically what you've learned growing up was the enemy.
Well, and then there's other cases where, so you had Nicholson, who was spying for the Russians. He was an American CIA officer who was spying for the Russians. He was ultimately arrested, thrown in prison. He actually convinced his son to keep spying and stealing information for him to pass on after the fact, right? So he was able to continue to manipulate and twist, so it's just, there's so many, the psychological aspects of it are fascinating.
Yeah. And that's the stuff that I would like to see more of in Hollywood. So if ever you get a script you sent your way, or somebody's working on something, please let them do more of that. Because we're not lacking in action scenes. That's not what's lacking in Hollywood.
I think what we need to do is trust the audience, that the audience actually can get engaged by the real human drama, right? If it's written well. We don't need to be distracted every 45 seconds by another car chase or jumping, off the Burj Al Khalifa, or, a gunfight.
All right. Well, I want to be cognizant of your time, and we still have the bonus part to do for Patreon with questions from my patrons, and I do have a really good one from Barry Eisler, so I'll give you that as well. So I think people can reach you at cognosgroupconsultants.com, and I'm going to put links to everything we talked about in the show notes. And your Instagram is Texas Spy Dad.
Texas Spy Dad, yeah.
All right.
So yeah, Texas Spy Dad, I spent a lot of time looking at the intelligence community's history and trying to educate as much as I can without giving away anything that I'm not supposed to give away. So those are definitely both places that people can reach me. Cognos Group is kind of my private consulting business that helps high net worth individuals as well as businesses with how to think about security in this world today.
Well, I want to thank you, Doug, for being my guest on the show. Before we get to the second part, and despite me screwing up with forgetting to hit the record button, I think we covered most of what we talked about before the recording started. So my apologies to the audience. That happens when you're running as a one-man show, doing everything. I don't have a producer. Producer is me.
No worries, man. Yeah, it's all good.
Okay, folks, so join us on the Patreon. That's where all the bonus episodes are and a bunch more. And if not, I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye-bye.